All right, today we're talking all about reference tracks. I'm going to briefly go through why we use reference tracks and give you some pointers and talk about some of the do's and don'ts. And then we're going to get into a method where I break down how you can really accurately get into your reference tracks with 3 free plugins and really dissect them and compare them to your own. It's a really awesome method, so let's get on into it. So let's start by talking about the importance of using reference tracks. When you're focused on your mix, you get lost in it and you get really wrapped up in how the mix sounds relative to itself. So a reference track is there to give you that target, that point of relativity, so you can compare what you're doing to something that's already been professionally mixed and mastered and released. And yes, you do want to use pro material. It's ideal to use something that is the product of a big label, big studio. Those are great references to use. But when you're getting lost in your mix and you switch over to your reference, it's very natural to all of a sudden be like, wow, my kick is too loud, or I have way too much high end. That's all part of the normal process of mixing. So those references are there to keep you on track. Another really important thing you got to remember is your mixing environment. You're stuck with your setup in your room with your speakers, and every room and every setup is different. So when you bring in a mix into your DAW and play it back on your system, that's a really invaluable reference. Listening to a really awesome mix on your system will help you work around all of the imperfections of your setup. Because if you can hear an awesome mix on your system and you use that as your goal, as your target, then you can make the most of your speakers in your room because you have that reference. So reference tracks are absolutely crucial for getting a professional sounding mix. Without it, you're just kind of mixing blind. I do find it's helpful to use a reference at the beginning of your mix and at least a couple times during the middle of your mixing process, and reference it again at the end in case you need to do some overall EQ adjustment on your master bus. And as far as genre and what kind of song to pick for your reference, I think you will find it's most useful if you pick something very similar. Not necessarily in key or in tempo, but if you're mixing metal, you want to reference metal. If you're mixing modern pop country, you want to reference country and probably not some old Willie Nelson song from the 80s. If your song is piano heavy, there's really no point to reference a guitar heavy song that doesn't have any piano. So yes, the genre is very important, but what I think is also equally important is the overall feel. If something is upbeat and happy and snappy and toe tapping, you want to find something like that. If it's melancholy or abstract, you need something like that. But most importantly, your reference track does not have to be a song that you like. It has to be a mix that you like. Pick a mix that you really admire. And now let's dive into this method, and I want to show you how to use them. So for this method, for reference tracks, you're going to want these 3 plugins on your master bus, and you're going to want everything else on your master bus disabled. And all 3 of these are free. You're going to want them on your effects chain on the master bus in this order. The first one is Isolate by Tone Booster Pro Audio. And if you caught my last video on mixing mid-range, I gave a breakdown on how to use this really sweet little free plugin. And next in the effects chain, the second plugin is a loudness meter, and this one is called ULean. You could use an RMS meter. This one is LUFS, which works really good. And the third plugin in the strip is the Spectrum Analyzer. This is Span by Voxengo. And I have a whole tutorial on this plugin as well, and I will link to those videos in the description here. So on your master bus, you have these 3 plugins in this order: Isolate, the loudness meter, and the Spectrum Analyzer. And then you drag your reference track into the DAW. Mine's up here in red at the top. And for copyright reasons, I'm not using a commercially mastered song that everybody knows. I'm using one of my older mixes, but it'll work for this. Now you got to remember, a commercially mastered reference is going to be louder and more compressed than your mix. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is level match our mix to the mastered reference. So I just like to leave the reference track on mute, and that way when I hit play, I'm listening to my mix. And when I go to solo, now I'm listening to the reference. And we use the loudness meter here to level match. So my reference is ringing in at about negative 15.7 to negative 16 LUFS. And this is the one that we're mixing. And it's also right around in the same neighborhood. So that's what you want. You want to get your LUFS about the same for your mix and for the reference. That's super important. There's really no point to reference at all unless you get the level match correct. Otherwise, your ears are just going to be tricked. Now, if you're the kind of mixer that likes a compressor or a limiter on your master bus, then what I recommend is instead of putting your reference song into a regular track, you'll want to use a VCA track, which is basically just a track that is only dedicated to volume and it doesn't do any signal processing. Then hopefully, depending on your DAW, that'll make it so your reference track is not also being processed by what's on your master bus. But if that doesn't work, you might have to park your mix into a separate submix track that's taking the place of your master bus. That way you could disable everything on your master bus, but get your reference track in on your DAW and not have it be processed by anything else on your master bus other than these 3 plugins. And yes, a WAV file is best for your reference song. An MP3 will work okay. If you're getting a song off of iTunes or something, their frequency response is actually pretty good, but remember that when you're looking at the really low and really high frequency response, and don't obsess over it too much trying to match your reference, because your reference will be slightly compromised down in the subs and way up in the high air range. But that's the setup. You get your reference track pulled into your DAW and you make sure that it's level matched with your mix, LUFS, and then you make sure that it's not being processed by anything on the master bus other than these 3 plugins, and now we're ready to start referencing. There's a couple different ways to reference that you might find useful. One is to A-B back and forth pretty quickly, and don't give your ears too much time to adjust to either mix. That way you can just see what jumps out at you. And when you're A-Bing really quickly, sometimes you might find that it's easy to tell that the lead vocal is noticeably louder or quieter in one, or the snare is louder or quieter in one, it's very obvious, or my rhythm instruments are obviously louder than in my reference, stuff like that, things that'll jump out at you. The other way would be to sit in your reference song for a couple minutes and really let your ears get used to it before you bounce back to your track. And then in those few seconds when you bounce back, before your ears reacclimate, you'll probably notice other things that you wouldn't notice if you were doing quick A-Bs. But that said, here's the thing about this method that sets it apart from just listening back and forth to our mix and the reference track. Here we can actually dig into our reference on 3 different levels. We could use the first plugin, the Isolate, to get into specific frequency ranges. And the crossovers for those frequency ranges are up here at the top. So if I turn my reference back on, there's just the mid-range in my reference without the lows and the highs going. And now I can compare this to just the mid-range in my mix. And now I can compare the mid-range between the 2 mixes on the loudness meter, so I can see if my LUFS is the same. So I can see if the reference is quieter or louder in just the mids. And I can go down to just a narrow mid-range. So this is between 700 and 25. If I wanted to, I could drop this down and listen, say, just between 700 and 1K. And then I could compare that to my reference. And I could see on the LUFS in all of these different frequency ranges how I'm comparing to my reference. And I can adjust the frequency ranges. And then I can also just turn on the lows and the low mids, and I can see what that volume level is compared to. You know, here we're running almost -18 on the reference. We can see that our mix is a little bit louder than the reference is. So that tells me I might want to attenuate some of my low range. And let's listen to just the muddy low mids. So now we're just between 200 and 700. I can drop this down and just say listen between about 200 and 400. And this is the one I'm mixing, and we're running at -27, 26 LUFS. Let's go back to our reference. So I bet you're starting to see how insightful of a method this is. Our low mids are right in the ballpark for our reference, but below 200, we have a little more volume going on down there than our reference. So that means we might want to take a little bit out. We might be a little bassy. And then you could go into your highs and high mids, and this is our reference, and we can check our volume, and then we can unsolo it, and we can see what our highs are like, and so on and so on. Then you can also just mute out certain parts. How is our mix with the mids between 400 and 3K removed? And then back to the reference with between 400 and 3K removed. This is a really awesome way to not just be guessing with your ears about how your lows and mids and highs are related to your reference. You can actually get in, use these crossover settings to hone in on specific frequency bands, and you can go back and forth and compare that way. And we can also reference our mix in just the mid channel to the reference track's mid channel. And of course, we can reference our side channels just to the side channels of our reference. So using Isolate with the loudness meter, super awesome, very helpful to get a nice detailed analysis. And then basically you duplicate the same thing with the spectrum analyzer. Now here we're looking at just the side channel, of course, in the spectrum analyzer. And let's look at it in our reference. So we can see our reference has a little more side information than our mix does. Let's go to the mids. And back to ours. Yep, you can see a little difference there. And now here's a mid-side view. And take a look at our reference mid-side view. And then since we know that we had a little bit of issue in our low range here, we're at our reference. And so we'll take our spectrum analyzer and we'll zoom way in on the low range here. We could go down and take a look, and we could remove the smoothing, and we could increase the block size and see what's going on in the low range of our reference, see where the fundamental of the kick is, what's going on in the subs. We could solo out and listen around. We could increase the block size and slow down the average time and get a really good look at the fundamentals of the kick in our reference track. And then unsolo and compare those fundamentals to our kick. And we could zoom way up into the highs. Let's just solo out the high mids and highs. And we could take a look at the mid-side reference on our mix, and let's take a look at the reference track. Anyway, I think you get the idea. This is a really fantastic way to use a loudness meter and a spectrum analyzer and isolate out what's going on in your reference track and compare it to your mix. And then you're not so dependent on your ears alone. You have these tools to really dig into your reference track, zoom in as far as you want, get all the detail that you want. And then you could look at the trends over time. We could, slow this down, decrease the block size. And we could bring the smoothing back. And so now we're looking at the trend over time of the frequency response in our reference track. Let's take a look at our mix. A good way to do this would be to reference the loudest parts of the song, go straight to the chorus, but then you can change it up, and then you could dive into the verse and reference that way. And don't forget that on span, at any point, you can hit Control and hold down left click, and you can solo in on everything that's going on. So if I'm in my reference track and I want to see where the sibilance of the vocal is and where the snare transient is and where the air on top the snare is, exactly what's down around with the kick and how much bass is competing with the kick. And then I just go back into my track and I do the same thing and I go dig around. And unlike this solo option here on the spectrum analyzer, even though we can scroll to narrow and widen the bandwidth, we have complete control on Isolate with these crossovers up here. You can set these dials and dial in whatever settings that you want. And Isolate does also go all the way down to 10 hertz. So if you solo out the low frequencies, if I bring this up to 50, which I happen to know is just below the fundamental of the kick, now I'm down in the sub range. So if you're working with 808s and sub bass and stuff, which is a really important thing to reference, you can get into your reference track and just be looking at the subs like this. And likewise, one of the hardest things to match with your ears is the super high air. So if you're honing in on the super high frequencies here, and now I'll lower my crossover, and now we're down to 14K. You can really get inside of your reference and your track and isolate as narrow of a bandwidth as you want to do a comparison. And instead of just seeing it, you can hear it. This is the way that I have found with 3 free plugins to basically dissect a reference track and use it to the max. There's really nothing that you could want to learn from your reference track comparing it to your mix that you can't do with this method with these 3 free plugins. But there you go. I hope that helps. Let me know what you think, and thanks for checking that out. I hope you got a lot out of that. Hit me up in the comments and tell me how your references are going, and if there's anything else you want me to cover, let me know, and I'll catch you on the next one.